after all these years. Finally, I have them all.
Let me ask you a question. What do you think about Geo teams? Geo is a fairly divisive element in this game, as it really doesn't play nice with the other elements. In a game where elemental reactions are king, it's strange to see that Geo doesn't really factor into that. That being said, Geo characters aren't inherently bad. In fact, there are a few meta-relevant characters that come and go as needed, such as Yunjin and Zhongli. But what about pure Geo teams? Geo Supremacy, as some call it, is a very interesting beast. Just putting up to 4 Geo characters onto a team and hoping for the best. Well, given that I just got my hands on a Zhongli, I can finally test that theory out using my favorite character in this game, Noelle. So let's get started and really break down each member of this team in some detail before getting into the thick of it. Unlike my normal character breakdowns, I actually wanted to start with the team members first, and then break them down one at a time. Leading the charge is Mr. Zhongli, whose job is to increase damage dealt, generate energy, and provide some very rare Geo crowd control. Next is Albedo, who is also here for energy generation, but also for a decent amount of his own damage. Next up is Goro, who's here to buff the final member of our team. And finally, that team leader is Noelle, who is here to deal the damages. I'll be going through this in the order that they appear in my version of this team, and since I'll be covering 4 characters instead of just 1, I'll not be going into the same level of detail that I normally might, with the exception of Noelle, as she is the crux of this team, actually working or not. Starting with the CEO of Geo, here's what we're working with. Firstly, his skill. He can summon a pillar with the tap skill that deals damage and resonates with other Geo structures for additional damage. More interestingly though, you can hold the skill for a longer cooldown and a powerful shield that go along with it. His shield also gives a neutral damage increase, and by that what I mean is that it lowers the resistances of enemies to pretty much all sources of damage. This is important because Geo doesn't normally have access to these kinds of damage buffs like other elements. Even Physical has Superconduct, which I think speaks volumes to how desperate Geo is for these kind of damage buffs. Next up is his Burst, which drops a meteor on his enemies, which I affectionately call the Meatball. This Meatball also applies a petrification effect which stuns enemies for several seconds. Next up are his passives, which are fairly important, but his first one is not overly exciting, as it only makes his shield even beefier, which is still pretty good, if a little uninteresting. The next passive increases Zhongli's personal damage based on his maximum health, and I do mean all his personal damage, including his normal attacks. Physical Zhongli was briefly a thing because of this. More importantly, this means you can stack a ton of health on him, giving him access to a very large shield, as well as a very large amount of damage, especially from his burst, which becomes a very spicy meatball. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go over constellations for Zhongli, as well as the next character, as they are both 5 stars and their constellations have very little value for what we're trying to do here, and are generally out of reach for most players, myself included. Next up on the list is Albedo, who in my opinion is a very underrated character overall, but he is especially an all-star in this lineup. Firstly, his skill, which is a flower that he leaves on the ground. If you stand on it, it's an elevator, which is neat. Honestly, this often does more harm than good, but it is a useful tool in very fringe cases. More importantly though, it leaves an area where if you deal damage to an enemy in it, it will do damage based on Albedo's defense stat, and that damage can be fairly substantial, as well as a great way to generate energy for your other Geo characters. Next up is his burst. This deals damage. That's it, nothing special. Just a big burst of damage based on his attack stat. It's kind of awkward, but this becomes more interesting when we talk about his passives, and more importantly the build, which may end up disappointing some viewers, but we'll get there when we get there. With that, here are his passives. First up is Calcite Might. Simply put, Albedo skill does more damage to low health enemies. It's an execute. Not bad. Following that is Homuncular Nature, which gives your team a fairly substantial elemental mastery buff, which is pretty useless for a Mono-Geo team, but is a fairly good buff for a lot of different teams, so I figured it was still worth mentioning. Now, let's start getting into the meat and potatoes of any good Geo team, Goro. Let's talk about his skill first, which is the thing that's actually going to make this work. When activated, he puts down a banner that does a small amount of Geo damage and leaves a large area around it that applies a buff to your characters based on the number of Geo characters in the team, including himself. If he's the only Geo character on your team, you get a defense buff. If there is at least one other Geo character on your team is more resistant to interruption. And finally, with a minimum of 3 Geo characters on your team, you gain a Geo damage bonus. His burst is pretty simple though, given all the texture. Trust me, it's not as complicated as it looks. Basically, it creates the buff from his skill in an area around your selected character. All the other junk here is about crystal collapses. Don't worry about it, it's not important. For his passives, we have his first talent with the long name, which simply increases your teammate's defense for 12 seconds, which for most Geo characters is a nice little damage buff. His second passive, A Favor Repaid, which increases his personal damage based on defense, is fine. His damage honestly doesn't really matter, but this is a reasonable little bonus for any extra defense that you happen to get on him. His constellations, on the other hand, really play into his supportive abilities, so let's talk about the important ones. C1. When Goro's skill or burst deals damage, you lower the cooldown of your skill by 2 seconds, up to a total of 10 seconds. C2. When you pick up a crystallized crystal, you extend your burst. C4. When you have 2 or 3 Geo characters on your team during your burst, Goro heals your team based on his own defense, making him a potential healer for this sort of team in a pinch. And finally, C6. While his buff is active, your teammates gain bonus crit damage based on the number of Geo members, up to a total of 40% bonus crit damage. Which, trust me, that's a lot. So that was a mouthful, but now we round this out with the unofficial team leader for this squad, the almighty Queen of Geo, the actual Geo Archon herself, Noelle. So Noelle's normal attack actually does matter here, but it doesn't really offer anything exciting other than a few okay ratios. The attack itself is not important, but it is important to the playstyle. Her skill, on the other hand, is a bit more interesting as it deals damage, provides a shield, and has a chance to, on hit, to heal your whole party based on her defense. Like all of it, the damage, the shield, the healing, all defense. This is really good, especially when you're pairing her with Goro and his wide array of defense and Geo buffs. The shield itself can do a good chunk of damage on its own, seriously. But now, for the bread and butter of her kit, her burst. After activation, you will do a big swing of attack scaling Geo damage. Attack scaling, huh? That's weird, right? Well, it also provides a long-lasting Geo infusion that also increases Noelle's attack stat based on a high percentage of her defense stat. Makes sense now, right? On top of that, as an added bonus, it also persists when you change characters, unlike many other infusions in the game, meaning you can reapply your character's buffs and go right back to dealing damage with Noelle. For her passives, you have an emergency shield when your teammates get low on health. This is a very nice effect to have when you screw up a dodge or even when you're just being a little bit too greedy. The second passive lowers the cooldown of her skill by 1 second for every 4 normal or charged attacks that connect with enemies. This one is especially important since Noelle's cooldowns are actually really long. Any means to smooth them out is extremely helpful. The whole kit on its own comes together pretty well, but before we can really move on, let's talk about these constellations, as these are actually what makes Noelle from a workable, fairly good character to an actual powerhouse. C1. While Noelle's burst and skills are active at the same time, the healing chance from her skill is increased to 100%. This basically means that while your burst is active, your whole team is pretty much always going to get full healed. It's kinda nice. C2, decrease the stamina cost of, as well as increase the damage of Noelle's charge attacks. In other words, she becomes the Beyblade she was born to be. This is what makes her really good in AoE situations especially. C4, when Noelle's shield breaks for any reason, she deals a large amount of AoE damage based on her attack stat. This ironically ends up being one of her most damaging attacks in her arsenal, given that while your burst is active, your attack stat is getting buffed by your defense stat, and when that shield breaks, it's gonna hit like a dump truck. It's not uncommon to get 70,000 to 80,000 points of damage from this sucker. Finally, C6. Noelle's attacks is increased by an extra 50% of her defense during her burst, and defeating enemies extends the duration of her burst to a maximum of an extra 10 seconds. This constellation is a massive damage buff overall, and really is the thing that kinda pushes her up and beyond, and actually makes her sort of viable and feel pretty good, even in a meta that doesn't respect her. So we've covered the entire team's whole kit now, and that was a lot to cover, but we're only really halfway there, aren't we? Next up, I want to go over each of their builds, stat priorities, as well as some weapons and artifact options for all of them. Don't worry, I don't plan on taking as long as the skills. For Mr. Zhongli, I'm using the new crafted polearm Rightful Reward, which gives HP and provides a bit of energy every time he is healed, which works extremely well on him. Alternatives for this include any energy recharge polearm, or, if you have it, Staff of Homa. I'm going for a 4-piece tenacity set to take advantage of the extra buffs to damage and his shield. For stats, I'm going for a mix of health, geo damage, and crit stats to provide my team with a very hardy shield while not skimping out on his actually pretty good damage. Here are the stats. Next up is my Albedo, which is using his signature weapon, the Cinnabar Spindle, which you got from his old story event, which gives defense as well as increases his skill damage by a percentage of his defense as well. If you don't have this weapon, honestly, just use the 3-star Harbinger of Dawn. There's really not that many other options for him, he's kind of weird. For artifacts, I'm using a defense and crit stat focused Golden Troop 4 set bonus to get the maximum damage out of his skill while he's off field. This set was seriously made for him, I'm not kidding, it's really good. However, the Opulent Dream set can be a good replacement for this set still, given that it's relatively new still. Anyway, here are his stats. Our last support character in this lineup is of course Goro, who I'll be having use Favonius Bow for the energy recharge, and I just don't really see another option for him at this time. You really just want him doing his burst as much as possible, so energy recharge is kinda your friend here. On the note of energy recharge, for artifacts I actually use a 4-star set, specifically the Exile set, just to get that little bit of extra ER in himself, but its 4-piece bonus lets other party members take advantage of that energy recharge as well. This is important for Noelle given that she can't actually generate energy for herself, like, at all. The whole set is really just trying to get crit rate for Favonius Bow and energy recharge to get his burst up more often. Not that they particularly matter, but here are his stats. And finally, we have the true Geo Archon herself, Noelle, who I have using the Red Horn Stone Thresher because, well, I mean, it's just the best weapon for her, but premium weapons such as Serpent's Spine or the Unforged, or free-to-play friendly options like White Blind, are a serviceable replacement as well. For artifacts, there really isn't much better than the Opulent Dreams set, focusing on defense, geo damage, and crit stats. For Noelle, it's a match made in heaven. But in a pinch, you might also consider something like Gladiators, or some kind of hybrid set that focuses on extra geo damage and defense. But let's be real here, Opulent Dreams is what you're going for. So I wanted to take some time and talk about the team itself. There are a few other Geo characters that you can consider or sub in if you're missing a piece of the puzzle, namely characters like Ning Wong for her wall, which gives a Geo buff, or Yoon Jin for her normal attack buffs. Other characters like Raiden Shogun for energy recharge can work as well, but then you're starting to go against the spirit of the team itself. So that aside, let's talk about a basic rotation and show off what she can do. We start with Zhongli's hold skill, and then burst, followed by an Albedo skill, normal attack, and then burst. The reason you do this is a timing thing. This helps you get some extra damage in from his skill. Then we switch to Goro and use his burst, then his skill. And finally, Noelle with her burst into her skill, following that up with either spinning to win or a series of normal attacks, usually until her burst runs out. If all went well, all of your bursts will be back up in time to do it again from the top. It's a pretty simple rotation. And you have some wiggle room if you need to correct something that went wrong, like getting less energy than you expected, for example. Also, with this setup, you are essentially indestructible in between two of the strongest shields in the game. All your characters are stacking defense or some kind of defensive stat, and just the natural bulkiness that comes along with running Geo characters. You are both the unstoppable force and the immovable object all at the same time. It's a pretty good deal. I've had a lot of success over the years using Noelle, and now that I finally have Zhongli, I really feel like the team has taken its final form. I'm really excited to show off a recent Spiral Abyss run using them. Even though this Abyss isn't the kindest to this kind of team, with the large amount of big single target fights, it still performed really well, and on the floors that it did really well in, it thrived. So let's get to the real showcase, and I'll see you on the other side. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed what I put together here and maybe got a new appreciation for the often forgotten element. Geo is my favorite element, and Noelle is easily my favorite character in this game, so I really hope I was able to show her off in a good light. This is my first time focusing on a single team comp versus a more character-focused video, so let me know how you liked it and what I could do better next time. If you like what I'm doing and think I deserve it, please leave a like and subscribe. And maybe check out our Discord as well, links in the description. Anyway, that's all from me. Cheers.